Thank you. So I'm going to do our quick presentation. I think so many of you from day to day are, you can't see the forest for the trees because you're really just, it's a day-to-day existence of putting out content and raising revenue and whatever. So I want to share with you some observations I have from being in this space for, oh my God, 12 years now, even more, funding startups of what I see emerging. And what I do see emerging, I would suggest to you, is that in the entrepreneurial news space, I am seeing, and I would assert, that there are new forms of journalism emerging, and they are not the journalism I grew up with for 20 years at the Philadelphia Inquirer. I think you can, if I were framing this as a research project, you would say that some of you as startups have a lot of journalistic DNA, but you have different aspirations. I suggest you are moving into an area where the value proposition of journalism is changing, and that value proposition for legacy media was probably changing long before business models were evaporating. And I think we're seeing a lot of journalists raising the question of whether our journalistic conventions, the things that we do on autopilot, we're not thinking about enough, and that we may be killing journalism with some of our conventions by not thinking them through. So maybe I should be wearing my bulletproof vest here, but here's what I see. I see some evolving aspirations. We used to talk about speaking truth to power, afflicting the comfortable, and covering community. I think in the entrepreneurial news space, we talk about creating knowledge, serving the needs of the community, and building community instead of covering it. I think we see some emerging taxonomies that I'm working on putting a framework around so that you can do some description and some articulation and maybe some best practices, and I would welcome you to add to these taxonomies. So they range from knowledge-based journalism to soft advocacy to activist journalism to restorative narratives, social and solutions journalism. I'll run through them really quickly. I don't know how many of you saw the Jill Abramson column in The Guardian last spring, where basically she declared, based on her own reportage and her own knowledge and her manifold investigations of Hillary Clinton, that this may shock you. Hillary Clinton is fundamentally honest. So she single-handedly sort of debunked the master narrative around Hillary. I would suggest to you that we are increasingly seeing some level of journalists, Bill McKibben on climate change, for example, who are so knowledgeable about their subject. They don't need necessarily a he said, she said paradigm to report about it. I think in many of our communities, we are starting to see, especially in the niche topic sector, news sites organizing around a subject that they care about. In Philadelphia, I would point to Plan Philly that's covering the built environment, planning, zoning, historical preservation, something that most of our legacy media are hardly covering at all. But they're doing it through a particular lens, a point of view that says, we care about sustainable cities. We care whether there are bike paths, and we care whether the street environment and the streetscape is clean. It's not a partisan advocacy, but it does have a point of view. And you see the same thing with education reporting. If you look at the Notebook in Philadelphia, the Public School Notebook, or the Catalyst in Chicago, they are covering public education. And they, in some cases in Philadelphia, they got the school superintendent ousted. A lot of journalistic DNA here. But they're doing it through a particular lens, a particular point of view that says, we care about good education. In Chicago, when not enough people were signing up for preschool programs, the Catalyst actually held community forums to educate people about them and got them filled. And they basically said, look, it's a judgment call, but we exist to make the school system better. And I would argue that that's a fundamentally different mission statement than you get from a lot of traditional journalism organizations. I like to show my students this picture from urbanmilwaukee.com, which covers the built environment. They were doing a report on a really rundown streetscape. They hired a graphic artist to reimagine and to visualize what it could look like. And I ask, is this wrong? Is it unethical? Should we be doing this as journalists? Should we not be doing this as journalists? And if I have a room full of traditional journalists, many of them will squirm and hem and haw. Oh, I don't know. Well, we can't advocate for a nicer street, you know. But a lot of the younger students will say, well, yeah, like, what's wrong with it? So I would suggest that these are some of the questions that we're wrestling with. And I will tell you that 2 years after Urban Milwaukee ran this photo, they cut the ribbon on a streetscape that looks very much like the graphic artist's iteration of it. So, we talk about, do we want to be a commodity or do we want to be a catalyst in our community? How do we render being a catalyst as journalism? What does that look like? And how can we do it responsibly? If you look at the Center for Investigative Reporting in California, what they did on labor trafficking, they're running graphic novels, definitely with the point of view that labor trafficking is wrong. Certainly what Glenn Greenwald does at The Intercept has an activist point of view. The idea of restorative narratives, uh-oh, I think I lost my. If you look at Newtown, talking in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shootings, after all the national media disappeared, during the catastrophe story, the Newtown Bee sort of said, well, we have to rebuild this community. What does that journalism look like? After Katrina, after Sandy, I think we're starting to see a new form of journalism emerging that tries to figure out, again, how do we make this community whole again? How do we focus on the process of rebuilding, of collaboration, of creativity, to do whatever? I think if you look at CUNY's social journalism program, I'm a mentor for these students at CUNY, fascinating program, where in 1 year's time, these students have to identify a community, assess the needs of that community, and figure out how to impact that community with documentable impact. So we had a student last year who decided her community was going to be Queens, and in particular, the motorists who are running over pedestrians and bicyclists in Queens. Make Queens Safer, it's called. 1 year later, she had the metrics to show that she not only became a thought leader on this particular issue, but she actually identified the intersections that were the most problematic, had the incidence of casualties going down. Finally, solutions journalism. San Francisco did an 80 media partnership last year covering homeless. They had a whole column on solutions journalism. They even dreamed up their own solution and test drove it with stories. I'm an old civic journalism person. Solutions was a part of that. I don't think you have to twist yourself in a pretzel to do good solutions journalism. Some people think you have to demonstrate positive deviance and whatnot. I think your community would welcome a menu of suggestions of what works elsewhere, and they can figure out for themselves what might work or what might not. So if you're looking for a trend story, I think we see signs of change. We see new journalism degrees being created around social journalism. We see calls for new taxonomies and new names, and I think more so than ever before in this particular presidential election cycle, we have seen that the traditional conventions of journalism are broken. They are not working. There are columns about false equivalency, balance, questions of whether grading one candidate on the curve, more willingness to out and out use words that we didn't have before. If you look at Clay Shirky's Storify on news organizations actually willing to label Trump a racist, that's we would never do that before. Labeling lies a lie. So I think we're seeing new aspirations too. If you look at the Christian Science Monitor, very interesting restatement of mission. We're seeking to go from knowledge to movement. In 5 years, the Monitor will be building communities around intention and intentionality. Is a very different mission statement. And I think probably for a lot of you, some of these mission statements are aligned closely to what your aspirations are. So I think as we build this out a little bit more, I think where the question is, can we help news organizations expand their focus beyond new business models for news and experiment with new journalism models for news? And that's it. Want to read more? There's an article on Medium. Does this make sense?
Yes. I've got one.
Yeah.
Do we really need new models of journalism, or do we need to get back to some fundamentals? Are we talking about the same thing?
I'm a person who bears the scars of the civic journalism movement, and I know how traditional journalists hated anything with a label. But now we see actually civic journalism coming back again, being validated. It only took 20 years. I think we do need labels. I would assert that journalists are not very creative people. They're not very imaginative people. You need to set out what we're talking about. You need to show proof of what works and what doesn't work. And I think if you label it, document impact, you're validating it.
And maybe causes us to reassess, think about it differently. If we just say, oh, we're going to get back to doing the same old thing, it causes us to do the same old thing?
Invite more than digital creativity, basically. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Patty Lombard, and I'm from Los Angeles. Do you think it's because, and I'm not a traditional journalist at all, came to it more as a community, an engaged community person who's really interested in telling the stories of our neighborhood and building community. So your presentation really resonates with me, and I'm wondering if it's because traditional journalists see themselves as observers, and it's really important to be objective, balanced observers, whereas others of us who come in and say, oh, I could see that better, I could do that. I mean, do you think that's just the fundamental nature of the way we educate and train journalists?
Yes, I think dispassionate neutrality is a convention of journalism. I'm not saying it's always good or always bad, but sometimes you can be so neutral that you're actually, and I would argue in this presidential race, media may be affecting something that they don't mean to affect by that particular convention. I think it's interesting, the Urban Milwaukee example. That site is run by 2 web designers, not journalists. They don't know they're not supposed to hire a graphic artist to create a visualization. To them, it's absolutely logical. And if it's absolutely logical to them, it's probably logical to their community too.
I have so many, this resonates. I am a traditional journalist. I came out of newspapers around the country and whatnot. At the same time, when you go to IRE or you talk to people, occasionally you'll hear them talk about the muckrakers of the earliest 20th century, Ida Tarbell.
Activist journalists.
They were huge, Lincoln Steffens. And so there's this disconnect sometimes. And I think also that working in newsrooms, I think sometimes one doesn't take a step back and realize your own social location as a person, and realizing that, what your view is, I'm going to use the word normative. There are other folks out there in communities who aren't represented sometimes, and I think journalists can be more thoughtful and imaginative about these kind of questions, because the world that we have came from someplace, history, all this kind of stuff. And that's the reason I resonated. I know I'm probably not sounding coherent here. There was so much there that you were talking about. But journalists have to kind of rethink. And your presentation was very helpful.
Well, I would suggest Jay Allred's idea of baby in a box fits into it. If he does a campaign for that, that's something, whether we call it activist or whatever. I would also suggest to you that we classically define a news story as conflict. And we do not know how to render consensus as journalism. We do not know how to cover consensus in our community because it doesn't fit. So.
I just want to say that this has been the most eye-opening presentation for me. I went to journalism school in the late 70s, early 80s. And even though I got the degree, I never really wanted to work in traditional journalism. And, you write what happened, you get a quote from this side, you get a quote from this side. I found it absolutely mind-numbing. And I went in different directions for many years. And recently, sort of like Patty, my partner here, got back into hyperlocal journalism from the community activist standpoint. And suddenly I'm finding what I found completely mind-numbing 35 years ago fascinating right now, and exactly where I want to be, because it's doing all these new things. And you just put into words all the things that have sort of made the difference for me in what local journalism is today versus what it was back then, and how and why I came back to it. I think it's brilliant. Thank you.
Well, in more than a few instances, there are people who run hyperlocal news sites that have been elected to public office. Now, you might say, oh my God, that's a conflict. And Gordon Joseph, right here, is former mayor, former whatever you call it, so mayor-like thing. But I think that there is a level of stewardship that's recognized in many communities from these sites, that they so trust you with the news, and that they now trust you to be a leader in public office. So that's, again, something else ethically to wrestle with or whatnot. But
somewhat related to that, because we're all building from the ground up completely new organizations, we don't have that sort of institutional weight of, we've always done it this way. And we don't have to even kick against that. Just about everybody in this room is a CEO. You're the one that makes the decision how your business is going to run. And that's, gives us so much more flexibility to tackle a different approach.
well, and you don't have to be anointed by the College of Cardinals. You
Exactly.
don't really have to. You don't need that validation. You need the validation of your community.
Thank you, Jan. Up next is Tracy Powell, who is a senior fellow at the Democracy Fund, the founder and editor and head cheese at All Digitocracy. She was a Knight Fellow at Stanford, started in journalism at the Augusta Chronicle and the Austin Statesman American, and she's going to talk a little bit about some ideas we can steal from people who have way more money than we do.
Thank you. So full disclosure, unlike most of you, I got my start in circulation and advertising. So I didn't start off my professional career in the newsroom. Let's see, get my, here we go. I might need your help. Well, I was trying to, is it bigger? Oh, that's just, there we go. Thank you. So yeah, here we go, cool. So the fellowship at Stanford gave me an opportunity to get back to my roots in circulation, which was really interesting. I'm going to talk about a lot of stuff that you've already heard over the past couple of days. And then I'm going to say some stuff that's the opposite of what you've heard. So first and foremost, all the emphasis has been on clicks and traffic, right? Well, no more. Marketers are interested not in so much quantity anymore. They want to know exactly who is coming to your site and what they are doing. They want to know, they want you to be able to have engaging conversations. They want you to have actual relationships with your users. And that is one of the things that the Washington Post, which became my case study this past year, is doing really well. It's coming closest to actually personalizing the news by building relationships with their users. Now, yesterday, we heard a lot about Facebook and Chartbeat and Harken. All of these are tools used to build relationships with your users. They are not the only things that you can do, but they are certainly some very good things that you can do to help build relationships. But your relationships start with these social media platforms. These are the dominant paths to your content. Facebook, my friends, is not our enemy. I prefer the term frenemy. We have to learn how to leverage our relationship with these platforms, the paths in which our users come to us, and convert them to more loyal consumers for us, right? That's the end goal. So how is the Washington Post doing this? last year when I came here, I talked to you guys about a story called Zola. Anybody remember this? Okay, great. So this story happened because this woman took to social media and she began tweeting out a personal story. I think it was, I forget how many tweets she tweeted, but anyway, it caught Ava DuVernay's attention, caught Oprah's attention, caught every news organization's attention, and everybody did the typical thing, right? They threw up the woman's tweets on their web pages in order to grab traffic. The Washington Post took it a step further, and they actually, can you believe this, reported the story to find out if it was actually true. And they did. They found out that story that was too crazy to be real was actually real. I started seeing all of this traffic, and I think I mentioned this to you guys, all this traffic going to the Washington Post site, huge numbers, and I saw on social media where everybody was talking about this, and I was wondering, how is the Washington Post getting these people to come back? These are all people who had never even interacted with the Washington Post 9 times out of 10, or maybe they interacted, but they never intentionally thought about the Washington Post, let alone actually clicking to go directly to their site. So I called, being a Knight fellow, you can do certain things. I called the vice president of the Washington Post, and I asked him, what are you doing with these people? How are you getting them to come back to your site? Interesting question, he said, Tracy. Thanks for asking. So the Washington Post it decided to develop its own suite of software. They built their own technology. I think someone talked about that yesterday, build your own technology. That's what the Washington Post did, but the Washington Post can afford it. We're going to talk about how you two can do some of the same things. So the very first thing that they did was develop a tool called Bandito. And all that is machine learning. The computer changes headlines to optimize clicks to the content, right? So we can do that manually. On top of that, they've developed another tool called riveting. So riveting is really interesting. Riveting follows the user as they read the content, as their eyes go down the page. And right before that person clicks off to go back to their social media feed, Facebook or whatever, they get a pop-up box, and it says, would you read this story next? Or this story next? And that other story could be a Washington Post story, or it could not be a Washington Post story. It can be a competitor's content. Just one simple question. And the Post just needs you to answer that one tiny question in order to learn a little bit more information about you, developing that relationship. Also, before you leave, they attach a unique user ID to you. So when you come back, they know when you do. And they know what the next time you come back, but also what you're reading and what you're doing. Like a cookie, but it's a unique ID number, so when you log on, that number pops up. So they know when Kelly comes back, and how often Kelly comes back, and what she clicks on, and what she's reading, and where she goes back to. Because don't forget, Washington Post is heavily invested in instant articles. So they know they may not know exactly what you're doing because Facebook is not going to share all the data with you. I tell you, they didn't share it all with me either, I tried. But they are sharing little bits of information about your journey from discovering their story, all the way to acquisition, and in this case, when you go to the Washington Post and you might register or subscribe, which is the end goal. So after riveting, there's another layer. There's another tool called Clavis. And all Clavis is Amazon's recommendation system, which is super smart. It's not like most of the other recommendation systems out there, which most likely won't recommend a story that you're really interested in or is anything relevant to what you're interested in. But Clavis knows, because after all, it's based on Amazon. So why are they doing all of this? And by the way, this process is called laddering. Anybody know about laddering? This process is called laddering. So basically it's doing exactly it's converting these casual users from social media to consumers, more loyal consumers. This is why they're doing all of that. So I got permission to use this. I saw this in my news feed, and I said, exactly. Zuri kept clicking on these articles that he finally just subscribed to the Washington Post. Now, I used to subscribe to the Post, and I got rid of it because I wasn't really reading, the papers were piling up. But then when I saw this in my news feed, I remember I did the same thing. I was clicking on the Post so much, let me just subscribe to the darn thing again. I got the digital edition. So yeah, they got me. They got me. But this is the goal, and this is all of our goal, right? So the thing about laddering is it goes deeper than this is a female 18 to 24 who lives in zip code 3094310. We need to use different labels, and that's what the Post is doing. They're putting people in buckets like we've typically done, but the buckets have different labels. Instead of female 18 to 24, they're saying this is Megan, who's interested in politics, but she's more so interested in politics happening in her particular state, but she's also interested in human rights happening in Syria. So with this laddering technique, the Post is developing a persona of Megan connected to that unique ID number and saying, okay, we're going to try to serve her more of those kinds of stories. We know she found us through Facebook. So along that path of discovery, we'll just load some other similar stories like that and make sure that she comes back to us. The Post only needs you to come back one more time. That's all they need. One more time, ID number, they're gathering information about you. And the goal is you come back again. They might say, I think after the 10th time, hey, we noticed you've been here. This is what you've been interested in. How about reading some more of these great stories, similar to, and they say, just give us your email. Just give us your email. That way, now they're sending you newsletters and the kinds of stories that you're interested in. They are doing this not with just their existing users, but as I mentioned with that Zola story, these are new users. In order to grow, you got to get both of them, right? So a lot of the stuff that we heard yesterday focused on the existing users. And that's fine, but what about the folks that we're not even thinking about yet? And most newspapers are so busy trying to figure out their current folks, they're not thinking about the potential people. But it's really important, because that's the only way you're going to grow. I want to say this. I don't represent any particular vendor, seller. There are certain things that I like about all of them. But I chose Parsley as part of my case study because Parsley retains data for 2 years about those unique ID numbers. So if you don't even bother to come back to the Washington Post for another 6 months, they still got you. So Chartbeat is real-time data. I think they're going to try to develop a new product, but anyway, Parsley is who I used. And let me say, there are tons of people out there. Smart News, different folks. I've talked to all of them, but these are the people who are really using data smart. Data is expensive. What the Washington Post did cost money. They, just between me and you, they're thinking about marketing this software to other news organizations. But really you need customization, I think. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can do some of the same things that the Post did. And also, if you have questions, we can go ahead and start talking. You can ask them now, but if you have questions about what I've gone over so far before we go into the next part. Any questions about the Post? Okay. So the very first thing, don't hate the platforms, play their game. Don't hate Facebook. Start collecting your own data. Right now, we count how many clicks we get to a particular story. We can do it smarter than that. The data is not the problem. I entered this thinking that the data was the problem, that we weren't collecting the right kinds. But we can get that information. We have it. We're just not using it correctly, and it's useless if you don't know how to use it. It means, not just counting clicks or on a piece of content, but assigning those unique ID numbers. We got developers here today. You can add, for their help in trying to figure out how to assign those numbers to people when they come to your site. You can track their behavior, not just, again, the clicks. You'll want to use this data not only to learn about the user's interests, but also figure out what kinds of content may make them want to come back. So how do we do that without Amazon? So I did some design thinking courses while at Stanford, when you have that kind of time. So you can do extreme user interviews is what we wound up doing. Take teams of 2 people, you go out into your community, and you talk to people who are highly engaged with you. They're subscribers. They've subscribed to you for years. They're active commenters on your site. Then you go to the other group, the other team goes out to people who are not engaged with you at all. They don't even think about you. And those mostly young people and people of color. And you talk to them. Don't talk to them about your product. Don't tell them about, they already know who you are. You talk to them about them. Ask them questions about what their interests are. Ask them about what they woke up this morning thinking about. What were they worried about? What were they concerned about? That kind of valuable information not only allows you to build relationships with people, but also allows you to figure out what stories you're not covering. And most importantly, what stories you're covering that you probably shouldn't be. Does that make any sense? There's an example in Alabama. We did the extreme user interviews, and it was for a particular beat. It was for their music beat. They were covering rap concerts in Atlanta and all this other kind of thing. So when they went out into the community, people were saying, well, we don't drive up to Atlanta, so we're not interested in that. So the Birmingham News said, well, maybe we shouldn't be covering that at all. And so they changed the way they cover the music scene, which was interesting. Next thing that we can do, don't be scared of the data. One of the things that coming from the newsroom, we use data to judge. We look at it and say, oh, this reporter got X number of clicks on that story, and hold that person up as the hero for the day. And then the other reporters feel bad because they didn't get that many clicks. Don't use it to judge. Use data as a tool to learn more about your audience, right? It's just another tool, it's another medium to build a relationship with the people in the community we're supposed to be serving. A long time ago, newspapers used to ask for registrations, right? Online, when people logged onto the site, we would ask people to register, and nobody ever did. They just clicked off. We need to go back to asking people to please register. We need to get that email address. It doesn't have to be anything substantive. You just, hey, give us your email address. We won't share your information. Make sure you're transparent about this stuff now. But just say, look, we just need because now people understand that they got to give a little something to get a little something. So one of the things that the Post does to entice people is that they partner with existing brands in the market and say, hey, if you register for our site, you might get a little 10% off your next meal at wherever. When I was in circulation, we would offer a trial subscription. You just registered with us. Those are really easy, simple things, and a lot of times they're free because the 10% off restaurant coupon is just a trade. I already talked about data meets design and how you structure those interviews. And by the way, I've written about this in Poynter. So it's like a quick and dirty guidelines. And you can just, I'll share the link. I'll tweet it out. The other thing that I got a lot of questions about was privacy. All the journalists are concerned about privacy. Okay, listen. We are already collecting this information about people. We're already doing it. The most important thing that you need to know is that you need to be transparent and let users know what you're going to do with the data once you get it. You don't, I mean, trust me, those of us that have marketing teams, and that's very few of us I know, but if you have a marketing team, they're doing this. The big boys are already doing this, of course. They know who you are, the marketing side. The problem is that the business side and the newsrooms are not talking to each other. I did one training in California at a radio station where there was an audience engagement team in the newsroom and an audience insights team on the business side. Why in the world are there two audience teams? No, we have one mission. There should be one audience team so that we can better serve the people we're supposed to be serving, right? So it's easier for you guys to do this because we don't have enough people to have two different audience teams. That's why I love this conference so much. I feel like I'm among my people. So anyway, we gotta. I mean, these are some of the things that simple, easy to do things. I'm giving you an overview right now. I'll tweet out the Poynter link so that you can read all the text yourself. But that's it. Any questions for me? I'm happy to answer anything.
We've got time for one or two quick questions. I have a question to ask of you guys based on you're talking about privacy. How many of you have a privacy policy, terms of service posted on your site so that people know how you're treating all the data that even if you don't know it, it's actually being captured on your server. You're capturing data about your users in your server logs. And that's an important thing. It's an important bit of transparency to tell people what you're going to do with it. Will you sell it? Will you give it to other people? Will you keep it just within your company? People should know about that.
Right.
Way in the back? Seriously? Why are you not sitting down here?
What you've talked about privacy and collecting information. When I started my site, I was so reluctant to to basically ask people for information. I just asked for a zip code, and it's so stupid of me now. I realize, and I have you don't get another chance, and then you go back, and then it's like, oh, can I get your address and your demographic information? And it was really like, what are you thinking? Like, that information is protected, and I tell them I'm not going to resell the information. But it was probably one of the biggest mistakes I've made, and I don't know how I'll ever go back to people and say, hey, can you give me your vital information so I can compete with Facebook and at least not compete, but offer the advertisers those kinds of insights on a basis, while still respecting people's privacy. But it was the dumbest thing ever.
So, it's not too late. It's not too late.
So you're saying dumb not to ask for enough information with that one hit, because going back is squeezing more information out of people again is hard.
So it's hard to don't ask for too much. That's one of the things I say in the Poynter. Don't ask for too much. If you're going to ask for too much, offer them something in return. If you're going to ask for that much information, in terms of zip code, if you are blessed enough to be able to afford Parsley, and I want to go back to that, but if you can afford Parsley, they give you the zip code. They have that when that user comes to your site. They have it all the way down to the geotag of where that person lives, that zip code. So you don't need to ask them. If you're collecting the right data, you don't need to ask them about zip code. In terms of, I started out wanting to figure out how to help people of color and younger users pay closer attention to our content. And what I learned was, you don't have to ask for that, necessarily have to ask for that demographic information. Zip code will give you some of that anyway. But also, that's kind of a superficial layer, right? Because what does a person's color tell you about? It doesn't tell you about their interests or their behavior. But when you start studying their behavior and you're learning more about their interests, that's the stuff, right? That's the meat. You start putting them in barrels according to their interests, not the superficial stuff like their gender and race. Does that make sense?
So I was just going to add that, this is John and Liz from the music website Local Spins, and one of the things that happens in music is everybody's got merch, right? Everybody's selling CDs and T-shirts and bumper stickers and hot sauce and all kinds of stuff, right? So it's not a perfect solution, but we have sold T-shirts and calendars, and when people order that at the website, what do we get? We get their name, their address, their email, and so that's not a perfect solution, but it is a way to kind of go back and get some of that info.
I love it.
Got time for one more? Who's got the burning question? All right.
Meg McGuire. When Washington Post gets all this stuff, right, and it then starts sending does it send a specific menu of articles then to someone who has those specific interests?
Right.
Right.
Once they get that email address, okay, so I'll back up a little bit. They have the unique ID, and they have a little bit of information from Facebook about the journey you're taking, and they can start loading their instant articles because, like I told you, they're heavily invested in that. So they use the instant articles as part of this whole process. But once they get your email address, because you've come back so many times, they've already gotten you to register at this point. Because the more often, with laddering, it's been shown through scientific research. There's a paper that just came out this week. With laddering, the more often you come back, the more likely you are to register, then to subscribe, then to click on the ad and buy something. So there's a method to the madness. Yeah. So once they have that email address, they're good to go then.
Thank you so much, Tracy.
Okay. Thank you.
And up next, Teresa Schmetting was not able to join us today because she had a bit of a conflict, but not only does the American Copy Editors Society have, they're another organization with a kick-ass acronym, but they're also aces about delivering replacement speakers. So Laura Browning is the managing editor of the AV Club, a site for the pop culture obsessed, and she is a board member for the American Copy Editors Society. And it says here, you're a proponent of the Oxford comma. We're going to have to throw down over this one because
I'm going to win. Sorry, I'm just going to try to log in real quick.
Okay. While she's pulling up her presentation, a reminder of a few things. Make sure you enter the drawing for the gift card. Make sure you please go vote for the best idea in that form that was posted on the conference blog. And be thinking today about what your takeaways are from this conference. What are the one or two things, specific concrete ideas that you've learned about that you're going to go home and try and implement? We've heard so many things over the past couple of days. It'd be great if we could go do it all, but we can't go do it all. So what are those couple of things that you're going to tackle as soon as you get home? And in our closing session, as we drink up the remaining beer this evening, we're going to pass the microphone around and we're going to talk about those things. What are you going to tackle?
Sorry.
It's all right.
1 second.
No worries.
Hi, everybody. My name is Laura. I am going to try this Google presentation view, which I've not done before, but I think that I can accept questions on it at this right here, if you want to take note of that. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to talk to you for just a few minutes today about fact-checking and editing your own work. As you all know, when you're up against deadlines, when you're close to the material, it can be extremely difficult to catch typos and factual errors in your own writing. There are several ways that mistakes happen. Lack of resources is probably the one we're all most familiar with. You don't have a copy editor on staff. You don't have another person on staff. You have to write your own work, edit your own work, publish your own work, etc. Two other problems that nobody really wants to admit to, but it is an issue. If you think that you're too good of a writer, you know, even editors need editors. I edited something that one of my colleagues wrote last week. He's one of the best writers we have. He's extremely careful, and he made a were error and also spelled Sarah Gilbert's name with an H on it, and she is S-A-R-A. Even the best of us make mistakes. It happens. You have to accept that it happens and force yourself to spend a couple extra minutes to try to catch that. Brain lock, I feel like, is kind of hand in hand with lack of resources sometimes. You just kind of get so overwhelmed by all the work you have to do. But take a deep breath. You're going to get a couple tips on how to find those errors, and fewer mistakes will happen. There's a couple ways that you can tell something needs to be checked. And it's kind of good to do triage if you are in a hurry, as most of us are. If something just seems too good to be true in your story, if there's just this incredible coincidence, check it out. It's worth a couple extra minutes on Google. If something doesn't make sense, if the internal logic of the story doesn't feel right to you, if something contradicts itself, if quotes contradict themselves, that's a sign to go back and spend a couple extra minutes there. Anytime there's repetition, like, I know this happens a lot, like you'll be writing a story and you'll have a quote and then you'll like copy and paste it and put it somewhere else and be like, oh yeah, it works way better there, and then forget to delete it somewhere else. So if you are taking right. If you take a step back and notice any kind of repetition like that. And then other things that need to be checked, anytime you see foreign languages, anytime there's numbers, particularly if math is involved, any superlatives. So anytime somebody says, like, this is the greatest country on earth, it's a terrible example, but any kind of like, this is the best, this is like the first thing that ever happened, they're probably wrong because, you know, a lot of that is just hyperbole, but it's always a good chance to go, a good warning sign to go back and check all that again. All right, so I work for the AV Club, which is a site about pop culture, so I have some weird examples for y'all today. This is from a interview that we ran a couple years ago with a guy whose job is to organize rock and roll cruises. I don't know if anybody's heard of the motorboat cruise. All right. So anyway, we did this interview. So this is just text, like, from the interviewee. And you'll see in the third line where it says Zach Wild. That came out when we got it back from the transcriber. It said Jack Wild. Which is, I mean, why would you like think twice about that if you're going through this and you're in the middle of all these other names that you probably know if you edit for the AV Club? And so we missed that, what said Jack Wild when it went to publish, and the PR sent us a note and said, no, it's Zach Wild. And the easiest way to check that, because if you just Google, even if you Google all those names in a row, like Jack Wild is not going to necessarily raise a red flag for Google or for you. Jack and Wild are both relatively common words and common names. Google will autofill a lot of things, and I don't know why, if the transcriber had Jack Wild, Google's not going to be like, did you mean Zach with 2 Ks? So the way that we should have fact-checked this is, you can see this piece was about who all these musicians were that they had on this rock and roll cruise. So the way that we should have fact-checked that is to start with the information we knew, which was there was a rock and roll cruise, and that, there's a website for that rock and roll cruise, and it would have been very quick and very easy if our fact checker had gone to that website, said what bands are playing, and they would have noticed that there was no Jack Wild, and they probably would have caught that error. If you have time, try to get more than one source. Sometimes you don't have time, but we've all seen instances where even a major city newspaper has perpetuated something that wasn't true, or somebody reacted a little too quickly to a tweet. Again, beware of the search engine autofills. Like with the previous example, if you had typed in Jack Wild, you would have been like, oh yeah, Jack Wild exists, sure. But was he on the motorboat? So that's very, very brief about fact checking. Moving on to editing. It's some of the same instances how mistakes can happen. We're busy, right? It's hard to do. You get really close to your story or your piece. You could end up relying on a wrong source. Again, if you found whatever newspaper that made an error, as everybody does, and you go down that rabbit hole, and then you haven't examined the rest of your options. The hardest thing to do is to read the material as though you're a reader. Especially if you have a background in copy editing at all, like you are in the nitty gritty, and step aside, like if you can get up from your desk for even like 90 seconds and do jumping jacks, which suck but work. Read the material like a reader would. Come to this as a reader, give it a fairly quick high-level skim. You'll notice a lot more than you think. If you have the luxury, read it aloud. It's amazing how many errors you catch when you do that. I often will see something and I'll like copy and paste it and into our like Slack channel and be like, hey guys, like, what do you think of this? And as I've pasted it in, I realize there's some other huge error, which is, I'm just reading it and moving it, and I think, oh, wow, I can't believe I missed that. This is my favorite trick to change something. I am a big proponent of just making your screen bigger. And I'll have an example of that in a minute. And again, if you only have a couple minutes to edit your story, check the headline, read it 3 times. It is really embarrassing when you make a headline error, and everybody will notice. Double check your first sentence, double check your last paragraph, and go back and read your headline again. All right, this is from a review that we just posted the other day. If you see the error, don't say anything, but raise your hand. All right, now we're gonna do some magic. So the reason I like doing this is because you're just making your screen bigger. You're not actually changing anything in your CMS or in your Word document that you have to worry about getting published in your story. You can also do things like change the font, which is helpful. You just have to be careful that everything looks good when you go to publish. And so this is why this is my favorite trick, because it harms nothing. You're just making your screen bigger. Now read it again and raise your hand if you see the error. About twice as many of you saw the error with the screen. I think I hit the Command plus 3 times. I made it 3 times, or not 3 times bigger, but I think I increased it to like 125% or something. The error is in the second line where and is repeated twice. So here, and are at the end of the line and the start of the next line, so real easy. And now they're both together on the second line, so it's easier for your eyes to see. And actually, Beyonce should have an accent on it too, but it's okay. Are there any questions? I think I can access them. Oh, no questions. Anybody?
Isn't zeitgeist a proper noun?
It's not.
Nope. Okay. I was thinking about that one. For me, I was pretty lucky when I was working at the Daily, because my desk was right next to the copy desk, and I had some really great exposure to some very cynical and grizzled but really, really talented editors, and got some insight into what they do and how they work, and it really helped me become a better writer, better reporter, and now that I am pretty much responsible for editing my own stuff, I try and get other people to read it, but quite often I'm just have to kick it out there into the wild. Applying those sorts of techniques are really helpful, and I think it's, we get a lot of compliments for, people tell us, oh, we see fewer mistakes in your stuff than in the Daily, and I like that as a compliment. I think people, readers notice, even if they're not telling you. People notice that something,
They tell us.
Well, plenty tell, but think of what a small percentage are telling you versus the ones that are just like, these guys are half-assed when you make a mistake like that. So we have time for a few questions, if anybody has some.
How often do you run into a situation that we've had a couple of times that has nearly caused major problems, where a writer has relied on a source that either turns out to be satire or was published on April Fool's Day?
I work for The Onion, so that does not happen. Ever. Yeah, I think we would be fired if we fell for that, just because of where we work. April Fool's Day is a really good point, though. It is pretty amazing the number of people who fall for that, or who somebody will post something on Facebook 7 months later and it will have been from April Fool's Day, and everybody says, oh my God, J.K. Rowling's writing another book. Yeah, it's always, you're right, always check the date. Always, if you're not sure. There's also a lot of, I've noticed in this election season, that there are a lot of sites that aren't really satire. They're more like hoax sites, and they will have a disclaimer, but they're like obviously deliberately trying to fool you. We've almost gotten caught a couple times by I think it's abc.co.com. I mean, people do they do a lot of work to make that look like an actual news site.
If you see the name Paul Horner in a news story, yeah, it's BS. That's the guy who runs that and all the other, fairly, the one who steals the logos of real news organizations, and but he always sticks his own name somewhere down as innocent bystander Paul Horner. So. raise your hand if you've made like an egregious flub in a headline and stuck it out there for the world to see for quite some time. Yeah, it happens. And so trying to pay attention to some of these tricks. And if you haven't been there, copydesk.org, ACE's website, has a number of great resources for trying to give us some tools to, make us a little bit more polished. Not really shiny, but just better.
I will say, if you don't have, if you really don't have time, at least read your headline aloud. They're so easy to skip over, and it's the one thing that everybody's going to notice. If you have an extra 30 seconds on top of that, reread your first sentence and last paragraph out loud if you can.
One thing that happens to me all the time, and it's kind of a changing in the format that forces you to re-look at it. I'll post something and then immediately go to post it on Facebook, and when the preview pops up, even before I publish it to Facebook, I'm like, well, I could make that headline better, and then I have to go back and redo the work. So just maybe changing my screen real quickly would force that.
Let's see. So that's just the Command Plus.
Yeah.
It's so easy, and
might reflow the words.
Yeah, and it won't mess with any of your CMS or Word document.
Thank you so very much.
Absolutely.
We really
Any other
appreciate
questions? Over here.
One second.
Much of your fact check discussion revolved around search. And I'm wondering what experience you have or recommendations you have in terms of making sure searches are getting results that are actually facts and reliable, and whether there's any redundancy in that regard or any other processes when one is reliant on Google, and one should be a little skeptical about Google, of course, in terms of fact checking.
I think that it's very easy to rely on Google itself and not use it as a resource. If you type pretty much anything into your toolbar, you'll get some sort of answer. And I think it's really important to not just take that answer at face value.
It might be from Paul Horner.
Right. Those responses often rely on a lot of Wikipedia or other sort of crowdsourced sources. So I think that if you are using Google, and obviously we're all using Google, it's important to use Google and then look at the results and say, okay, like, is this the New York Times? Is this the Washington Post? Or am I just like looking at the top response with, or I asked Google a question and it responded with something, in the nice big font. And I think the most important thing is to remember that Google is just one resource. It's not
Some of us might be using Bing, right?
Does that answer your question?
Anybody else real quick? One more.
What style book do you use?
We use AP style with a couple major changes. The biggest one that we use the Oxford comma, thank goodness. And then we have a proprietary style guide because we have a lot of very, very strange things in both the AV Club and Onion style books that don't exist in the world, really. So, but it's based on AP.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And we've got one more lightning round speaker. Christopher Ali is an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Virginia. Is a PhD from Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a Winnipeg native, a figure skater and instructor. And I take it you're not going to tell us about figure skating and how that relates to news?
Talk about figure skating.
Okay.
Great. Well,
Thank you very much for having me today. It's really exciting. I was particularly excited to get a professional reporter's notebook in the package, and it makes me really feel like, I'm one of the team here. So today, I want to talk about a project that I've been working on with Damian Radcliffe at the University of Oregon for the past few months on the state of small market newspapers here in the United States. And I want to particularly gear this talk right now about what Lion members can learn from print media. And then actually in a few hours from now, I'm going to be on a panel talking about how Lion members can best compete with print media. So I'm going to play both sides of the fence here. And some of the things I'm going to talk about, we've heard a lot about in the past few days, or yesterday and today, events and newsletters. I love the idea of like the smaller events and the pop-up bookstore in Berkeley. That's awesome. But I think it's important to also know what your compatriots on the print side are doing, specifically in smaller markets where they might be the only news voice. So just a little bit about the study. This is funded by the Tow Center for Digital Journalism with a larger title called Local News in a Digital World, Small Market Newspapers in an Era of Digital Disruption. You're all the disruptors, apparently. And again, this is a joint project between the University of Virginia and the University of Oregon. And we started our project with two easily asked but really hard questions to answer, it turns out, which is what is the state of small market newspapers in the United States, and how are they adapting to the challenges and opportunities of digital? And the question that Bode's asking right now is, well, why small market newspapers? And one of the things we've realized is that we don't really talk about small market newspapers. We tend to focus a lot on the big guys, on what the national newspapers are doing. We know a lot about the New York Times, the Washington Post. We heard a lot about the Washington Post from Tracy today about how they're using digital media. The Wall Street Journal, and we've learned also a lot about digital only and peer-to-peer groups such as yourself. But there's this missing middle of knowledge that we don't have. And one of the things we realized is that it's not so much a missing middle, but a silent majority. So out of the 7,071 daily and weekly newspapers in this country, according to the Editor and Publisher Data Book, 6,851 of them have circulations of under 50,000. And under 50,000 is how we're defining small market newspapers. So again, this is not a small gap in our knowledge. This is a significant gap. And that's something that Damian and I are trying to address with our research. And so what we started off doing is interviews with anyone and everyone who would talk to us. Over the course of the summer, we conducted over 50 interviews with owners and publishers and editors and journalists and academics and researchers, funders, and local and digital media innovators. And this included everyone from the VPs of Innovation and Digital at Hearst and McClatchy and Gannett to the executive editor of the Dallas Morning News, to many Lion members, and then all the way down to people like the editor and publisher and owner of the Calhoun County Journal in Bruce, Mississippi, who I'm going to be talking about in a second because they're doing really cool things in Bruce, Mississippi. And so what I want to share with you all today are three really kind of exciting and surprising findings that we have from our study. And you are all the first to hear this, actually. So it's exciting indeed. It will be written up in a report published by the Tow Center for Digital Journalism. It's going to come out in about 6 weeks, we think. But you were all the first. The first thing that really surprised Damian and I is optimism. There is a considerable amount of optimism among small market newspapers. And not only among small market newspapers, but about small market newspapers. And this is really surprising. And again, a reason why we need to start nuancing our conversations about the newspaper industry and about the local news industry in general, speaking of it as a monolith. There's a real disservice to some of these papers who have an optimism about them and their stories are not being told. right? In the conversation of the death of print and the death of newspapers and the challenges of local news, we're sometimes missing out on, again, the silent majority of papers. So just a couple of quotes from some of our respondents. It's a really exciting time for journalism because if you run a small newspaper, your potential audience for the stuff you're doing has gotten gigantic in the last decade. Another one, a lot of people would be surprised at the readership of community newspapers. And this is particularly true. If you think about the 6,851 small market newspapers in the country, that is a significant readership, even if the circulation is only 400, right? Which is how it is at some of the newspapers we spoke with. But some of them have 1,500, some of them have 15,000. I mean, this makes up a large chunk of the local media ecosystem in the United States. But I've got to also say that this optimism is not a naive optimism. And they also understand that the newspaper industry has done a really bad job defending itself against accusations of its own death, right? And this is coming from the vice president of Gannett. I think we've had this self-fulfilling prophecy where we've told our readers that we're dying and therefore we're dispensable. And they take you up on it when you tell them that. And that's an important thing to understand. And that was a really nice kind of reflexive moment to hear from the industry that they have not done a good job at saying we're not dead. Rather, they're just kind of taking it on the chin. So, you know, again, part of what we're hoping for is to tell these stories of optimism. And again, not a naive optimism. They know that print is on its way out. But in the meantime, they're doing some pretty cool things. So what are some of the reasons for this optimism? Well, this idea that they're understanding that they can capitalize on the trust, heritage, and tradition of incumbency. Right? They're oftentimes small market newspapers are the only news voice in a community, and often the only news voice in a county or a region, right? And there's something to be said from that, and they understand that, and they take that very seriously. You know, they're often the primary source of original reporting. And in that way, you know, you might have a community where the only time a television station rolls into the county is when, you know, someone catches a 30-foot snake instead of a 20-foot snake, which, by the way, was on the front page of the Calhoun County Journal when I interviewed them, and it scared the crap out of me. Right? I mean, snakes are just awful. They're also able to learn from metros, right? In this conversation of the death of the newspaper, we talk so much about the challenges experienced by the Philadelphia Inquirer, by the Boston Globe, by the Rocky Mountain News, by the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. And these smaller markets papers, they're not seeing that the disruption that the major metros have, and they're able to learn from it, sometimes frustratingly slowly. But other times they're able to adapt and sometimes able to fail faster than some of the major metros can. And again, I want to point to my favorite example here, which is the Calhoun County Journal in Bruce, Mississippi. And what they're doing in Calhoun is they're playing the long game. They're using Instagram and Vine, which is a video service, right, a video hosting service, to build a loyal readership among high schoolers, right, who may not be subscribers and probably won't be for a while because, you know, when you're in high school, even when you're in college, you're not reading a lot of local news, right? But who nonetheless might be one day in 5 years and 6 years and 7 years and 10 years. And we actually heard Jay Allard talk about this yesterday about from the Richmond Source about using Snapchat, right? Again, this idea of playing the long game and building brand loyalty among those who are typically not interested in local news, and particularly not typically interested in local news in a print edition. But what I'm hearing from Calhoun County Journal is that they've got high schoolers coming up to them, particularly around football games, right, which is a big part of life in the city or in the town, and they're saying, hey, we want to be on your Instagram feed, we want to be on your Twitter feed, we want you to shoot some video of us. And they're building excitement around the brand of the Calhoun County Journal, which I think is pretty cool. Right. So what does this mean for Lion members? What can we take away from these opportunities? And one of the big ones is this idea of partnership, to be able to capitalize on some of this optimism, right? And particularly if they are the only news source and you're just emerging in that community. Like to give a shout out to the coolest partnership that I've been hearing about, which is coming from my town in Charlottesville. We've got Brian Wheeler right here, and the partnership between the Charlottesville Tomorrow and the Charlottesville Daily Progress, which is a Berkshire Hathaway property, where Charlottesville Tomorrow is doing a considerable amount of the reporting and journalism in terms of several different civic issues, including zoning. So these are kind of the exciting opportunities that can happen to build on this optimism in smaller markets. So that's thing number one, this idea of optimism. Thing number two that we found is the importance of balancing what we're calling digital spaces and physical places. The idea that you need to be able to bring people together physically in time and space in a room and have a conversation. And this is proven to be a really exciting opportunity. And we've heard so much, we just had an entire panel about events, right? This idea of bringing people together as an opportunity, not only to make some money, but to build community and build brand awareness. And small market newspapers really are taking advantage of this. In Bend, Oregon, for instance, the Bend Bulletin has said that they're doing between $500,000 and $750,000 a year in events, which is significant for Bend, Oregon, right? Significant for anyone, really, but it's Bend, Oregon. Right, so not only are they able to bring people together and build excitement around their legacy product, but they're also able to profit from this. Other examples we've heard of bringing people together in a room have been focus groups, and this is something that McClatchy has actually done really well with their small market properties. Is rolled out a guide for how to conduct really great, really positive focus groups. Positive in terms of positive energy. You won't always get a lot of positive comments, but building again, bringing people together. We've also seen examples of open editorial meetings, which is pretty cool. Again, kind of seeing the sausage made. Which it turns out, I just recently learned that Sheboygan is one of the sausage capitals of the world. And and Sheboygan's doing some actually really cool things around events. So shout out to Sheboygan. I also just really like saying Sheboygan. So open editorial meetings. And then, as we heard Jan talk about as well, this idea of inserting yourself into the community through advocacy and solutions journalism, which is something that, again, we're seeing in small market papers, which is something that I don't think has ever left small market papers, but it's just something that we forgot to talk about in the conversation of traditional journalism and the crisis of traditional journalism, is that a lot of small market papers are telling us, hey, we've done this already. We've been doing this. We've inserted ourselves into the community, and this is an important lesson that we can learn from them, and go forward from there. So I just want to demonstrate one of the examples of bringing people together. This is the Coloradoan in Fort Collins, Colorado, who hosts secret supper clubs and a lot of events around food. Which is pretty cool. So they get a partner with a chef and a restaurant, and they are able to sell tickets to this. They've got another one, a whiskey and sushi event, and so they're hosting these secret suppers, and it's fairly low stakes for them, but it's a really great opportunity to build awareness and put themselves in the community. We've also heard about the Texas Tribune and their festivals, so doing something on a much larger scale, right? So I just wanted to give a shout out to them as well about the kind of events that they're hosting. Again, the idea of bringing people together, moving people off of just being metrics, like Tracy talked about, not just metrics, not just consumers, but rather they're human beings in a room that you can have a conversation with. So it comes down to two things here in terms of audience engagement, being at the center of the conversation in a community, and as Jan Schaefer told us in an interview with her, asking the question of what is the master narrative in your community. And I love this line, the idea of the master narrative. And again, this can really start with bringing people together in a room. So that's number two, bringing people together. Number three is diversifying revenue, which of course is a conversation that you've had amongst yourselves, and then I heard and learned a lot about yesterday and this morning. So some of the things that small market newspapers are doing to diversify revenue. I just talked about events. Some of them are looking into data management and SEO, so branching out. digital marketplaces, just listing events and job postings and kind of doing digital classifieds, sponsored content, and of course newsletters. These seem to be the themes that we're uncovering a lot in our interviews. And while not a small market newspaper, I think there's something that we can learn, like Tracy did, about the Washington Post with what the Dallas Morning News is doing. Dallas Morning News has really been an innovator in diversifying their revenue stream. And of course, they're able to do this because they've got the resources and the leverage to be able to, for instance, buy an events company, buy a content marketing agency, buy an analytics company, and buy a marketing company, right? So they did this. They did this because they're the Dallas Morning News and not the Calhoun County Journal, right? But it doesn't mean that we can't learn from this in terms of ways in which we can diversify revenue, whether or not you're a small market newspaper or you're a digital peer play hyperlocal news organization. Just the idea of thinking outside of the box, but also being able to capitalize on the trust you have in a community, and your skills, your digital skills. The Charlotte Agenda does really cool things, actually, in terms of a digital marketplace, and doing some really cool. I don't know if anyone follows them on their Instagram feed is amazing. It makes me really want to go to Charlotte, which is, I guess, that's what you want, right? You want to find your Sheboygan. I did it again. So again, just to point out a quote here, our citizens rely on us for services that we would never think about. And I think a lot of people, a lot of non-news people don't realize, they take for granted the role that the newspaper plays in the community. And again, this is coming from the Calhoun County Journal. But the fact that people go to them for things like phone numbers and addresses, right? They're the phone book they're the 411 of the community. In something so small. I mean, Bruce, I think, has 2,000 people, and Calhoun County is 15,000. So, thinking about, is there an opportunity to monetize this, but is there also just an opportunity to capitalize this on really owning that idea of being, we are a service to the community. And I think that's a pretty cool thing. So those are the three surprising things that we found in our research. But of course, there's also areas where the newspaper industry, small or large, is still struggling. And these are the tropes that we've heard for a while. Right? What to do with the print product? It is expensive, but it also represents a giant chunk of the revenue of small newspapers and large newspapers. At large newspapers, or at small newspapers, about 75% to 90% of their revenue, right, still comes from the printed product. But yet they're understanding that they get the idea that they need to figure out what to do with their print product. The other challenge we've heard is that of ownership. Right? And a lot of our respondents went back and forth about what's the value of being independent? Well, you're more agile, you're more responsive to your community, you can do things, you can fail fast. But then what about chain ownership? Gannett owns 10% of the small market newspapers in this country, right? They own, I think, about 177 newspapers, and the majority of them are small market. And so what are the advantages there? Well, they can centralize and regionalize if that's an advantage. They're able to roll out things like best practices for focus groups. They're also able to have a stronger web presence for some of these smaller newspapers, many of whom do not have a web presence, or some of them that I've spoken with, their web presence is actually just a scan of the weekly newspaper with scanned business cards. Right? That's what their website looks like. So there's no clear winner in terms of ownership here, and that's something that our respondents really kind of battled back and forth with. Obviously, resources. That's something that is going to always be a problem in the smaller markets. Cultural changes. How do you embrace digital media and digital technologies is something that we're still, again, there are some newspapers that we spoke to that really, really, really actively don't want to be on social media, or actively don't want a website, or do not see the value in these things. So that's a cultural change that is not easy, and it's something that I heard when I was at the APME conference 2 weeks ago in Philadelphia, that it's not just something facing small market newspapers, but it's also something facing the Miami Herald. And the last thing is learning what not to cover. And that's something that small market newspapers are still really struggling with. And this is a great quote from Jim Brady from Billy Penn, which is, you can't cover everything, but you can cover anything. And I love this idea. And I think that's something that small market newspapers are still struggling with, a lot of times because they are the only news voice in the community. But what happens when someone else moves in? What happens if a hyperlocal online organization moves in and suddenly they're not the only news voice? Learning about, what are the things that they can cover, and they can cover really well. So we had this great idea from one of our respondents. He used the analogy of, what's your Statue of Liberty? And for those of you, he gave me a history lesson here, which is that Pulitzer was actively involved in getting the Statue of Liberty installed in Manhattan, right? France had given it to New York, but they had to raise the money to bring it over and then install it. And Pulitzer was a big champion of this issue. So one of our respondents said, small market newspapers need to figure it out, what is their Statue of Liberty? And again, that's moving away from the more traditional incumbent forms of journalism towards that solutions journalism or advocacy journalism, right? What is your Statue of Liberty? And I just think it's a great metaphor. So a couple of takeaways, right? Print is not dead, especially in smaller communities, but the industry has done a really bad job communicating this. Being a digital innovator, and many smaller communities and markets do not have digital-first outlets for news. So there's a tension there. But on the other hand, some, like Bruce, Mississippi, are doing a great job. There's an opportunity for sponsorship here, partnerships here, content sharing, event collaborations, etc. Embracing physical places, being engaged with audience in person and not just through metrics. And lastly, learning what not to cover. Newspapers have moved from being mainstream media to keystone media, which is a term by Rasmus Clyde Nelson in this great book. And they need to learn that they can't do everything and anything. And then plus the tremendous value of associations like Lion. I'm sucking up a little bit here. But also things like the Local Media Consortium, which brings together small newspapers, large newspapers to share best practices and to kind of advocate with advertisers. In terms of what's next for our project, like I said, we're going to have an awesome report published in about 6 weeks in November or December, which I will gladly share with all of you. And then we're also launching a survey, because one thing we want to do is back up what we just said with numbers. So we are going to do a survey of journalists in small market newspapers. The survey is going to come out in a couple of weeks. And the full report will be published in early 2017. In fact, we're having an event at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism on February 14th. So what is more romantic than coming and hearing a couple of scholars talk about the future of newspapers? So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
We do have time for a few questions before we take a quick coffee break. Back there.
Hi, my name is Dave Lemery. I was a print journalist for 4 years until last week. I wonder how much of that sense of optimism that you noted is really false bravado, because in my case, it was part of my job to project optimism for my team. Whether I actually felt that optimism or not, well, I think the fact that I'm here kind of answers that question. So now I do. Now that I'm here, excellent. I do, absolutely. So I just wonder if some of the editors, publishers, VPs that you spoke to, if they're speaking optimistically because it's their job to and not because it's what they really think.
Yeah, that's a great question. And always the danger with these kind of in-depth qualitative interviews, right, is that you're getting the line. And one of the frustrating things right now about small market newspapers is that we don't have really robust numbers in terms of how the smaller newspapers are doing. But what I can say actually is that what the last set of data that we have about small market newspapers was from the Great Recession, and the majority of them do not, or money-wise, we found that they did not fire as many journalists And many of them, particularly the independent ones, particularly the mom and pops, are still making a profit. So the ones that we spoke to, at least, they are still making money. They're not making a huge return. So that gave us a little bit more confidence looking at these numbers to be able to say, well, maybe this optimism, yes, it could definitely be that we're getting still the company line, particularly from the major chains. But I don't think that the smaller ones that we spoke with had any, because a lot of them would start by saying, if we'd ask the question, how are you doing? They'll say, well, the newspaper industry is terrible. It's grim. It's awful. But then when we dialed it down into the specifics of the particular newspaper, they say, well, we are actually doing all right. And then they would share some numbers and financial data with us as well. So yes, and I think this is actually also where the survey will come in as well once we are able to back some of this up with numbers. So my hypothesis is that the optimism will get dialed down with the numbers, but I still think it's a genuine set of optimism there.
Just, I was curious about the difference between kind of the rural and the suburban papers.
Mm-hmm.
So, because if you're in a suburban market, then the big dailies are trying to buy you.
Yeah.
And you're in a different situation in terms of who you serve versus the rural markets, because you're just way out there on your own. And internet is a whole different question. So can you kind of talk about the differences and the challenges? But I guess before getting to that, of these 6,000 plus, how many of these are actually in in the middle of nowhere, and how many are in these areas where we're on the edge of the city and the city is coming to us? And then if you can talk about the differences and the challenges.
Right. Off the top of my head, I can't remember how the numbers break down, but we do have that data that I'm happy to share about how many of them are actually rural. I will say a majority of, particularly the weeklies, are in rural America. And I think you're quite right speaking about things like internet availability, which is a significant challenge for rural America, that they don't have a robust internet. So the print edition, again, becomes so very important. As for the challenges, I think that we're actually starting to see the major chains take more notice of these rural papers. Gannett just made some major purchases last year in Wisconsin and Louisiana of smaller rural papers. So I think that the experience of the suburban papers, which then got gobbled up and often then became just kind of transplants of the metro. My concern, to be perfectly honest, is that we're seeing this with rural papers as well, particularly in the practices of centralization and regionalization of certain activities in some of the major newspaper chains. So I think that could be a potential trend on the horizon.
Hi, I'm from South Florida, and the three major publications in South Florida are the Miami Herald in Miami-Dade County, and Broward is the Sun Sentinel, and Palm Beach County, you have the Palm Beach Post. All three of these publications are owned by major companies, McClatchy with the Herald, the Sun Sentinel with the, I think that's the Tribune.
Yeah.
And,
Tronc.
Pardon me?
Tronc. Tronc now.
and the Palm Beach Post, that's, I believe that's Cox. And with that, from 2008, all of their newsrooms, all of their, I'll give you an example. Like the Miami Herald was at 3,000 employees. They are now somewhere around 800. The Palm Beach Post was at 1,800. Now they're about 500, and the Sun Sentinel was about 2,800. Now they're about 700, and all I hear is about, and I interact with all three of them because I'm probably one of the few print publications or print publishers in here, and I interact with all three of them because my publication is actually inserted into their publications, and one of the things they're constantly preaching to me, and I constantly hear them say, is that they are trying to do as much as they can to go digital, because I'm seeing it every day that they think tomorrow is going to be the end of the world.
Yeah.
So to hear what you have to say gives me a little bit of hope.
Good. All right. That's great.
We've got time for one more.
we're a paper in East Lansing, well, not a paper, an online publication in East Lansing, Michigan. And one of the things I've run into is people think that when they get the local newspaper that comes on paper, which is the Lansing paper, that the reason they should pay for that is because it's paper.
Right.
And they shouldn't support us because what we do is obviously free. And so I wonder if you could help us think at all about the way of getting people to understand that what you're providing, whether you're providing it on paper or you're providing it online, is actually reporting.
Right. That's a great question. And if I had a really good answer for that, I would charge for it, I think. But I think I think this is actually where partnerships can become particularly valuable. Again, I'm going to point to what Brian is doing in Charlottesville, which is getting your byline in the paper, which I have no data on whether or not that, that physicality of seeing your logo, your byline there, that would increase the propensity for a consumer to want to pay. And I don't know what your relationship is with the East Lansing paper there, but I think that could be an opportunity. But I agree, and I think that part of the problem with this is a problem started by newspapers themselves, right? Is they just gave it all away for free, and then news became fungible rather than something that you would pay for. A lot of there is a small subset in the sample we spoke with that do use paywalls as small market newspapers, like rural newspapers, where their digital content is behind a paywall, and some of them have said that that's been successful as well. But my off the cuff answer would be partnerships. But this is actually something that would be great to brainstorm, over a beer or coffee as well, which is trying to think about how to increase the legitimacy of your publication in the eyes of consumers, right? Who feel that this is the only thing I need to pay for because everything else I can just steal.
Thank you very much. I know there was more hands raised. I'm sorry to cut things short, but we're, again, running rather over schedule. Right now we're going to take a brief coffee break, and then we have a couple more quick sessions in here before we have lunch. So go grab a cup of coffee, stand up and stretch for a couple of minutes. Thank you.